Hello, and welcome to Hip and the Diff for My GIF, a reading of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows for my girlfriend, who is at work and is probably very bored. We start at Chapter 5, Fallen Warrior, because that's roughly where we decided she'd be in her audiobook once I'm finished recording and uploading this video. Clears throat. Hagrid. Harry struggled to raise himself out of the debris of metal and leather that surrounded him. His hands sank into inches of muddy water as he tried to stand. He could not understand where Voldemort had gone and expected him to swoop out of the darkness at any moment. Something hot and wet was trickling down his chin and from his forehead. He crawled out of the pond and stumbled toward the great mass on the ground that was Hagrid. Hagrid? Hagrid, talk to me! But the dark mass did not stir. Who's there? Is it Harry Potter? Are you Harry Potter? Harry did not recognize the man's voice. Then a woman shouted, "They've crashed, Ted! Crashed in the garden!" Harry's head was swimming. Hagrid, he repeated stupidly, and his knees buckled. The next thing he knew, he was lying on his back in what felt like cushions, with a burning sensation in his ribs and right arm. His missing tooth had been regrown. The scar on his forehead was still throbbing. Hagrid? He opened his eyes and saw that he was lying on a sofa in an unfamiliar, lamp-lit sitting room. His rucksack lay on the floor a short distance away, wet and muddy. A fair-haired, big-bellied man was watching Harry anxiously. "Hagrid's fine, son," said the man. "The wife's seeing to him now. How are you feeling? Anything else broken? I've fixed your ribs, your tooth, and your arm. I'm Ted, by the way. Ted Tonks, Dora's father." Harry sat up too quickly. Lights popped in front of his eyes, and he felt sick and giddy. "Voldemort!" "Easy now," said Ted Tonks, placing a hand on Harry's shoulder and pushing him back against the cushions. "That was a nasty crash you just had. What happened, anyway? Something go wrong with the bike?" Arthur Weasley overstretched himself again, him and his muggle contraptions. "No," said Harry, as his scar pulsed like an open wound. "Death Eaters, loads of them. We were chased." "Death Eaters?" said Ted sharply. "What do you mean, Death Eaters? I thought they didn't know you were being moved tonight. I thought—" "They knew," said Harry. Ted Tonks looked up at the ceiling as though he could see through it into the sky above. "Well, we now know your protective charms hold, then, don't we? They shouldn't be able to get within 100 yards of the place in any direction." Now Harry understood why Voldemort had vanished. It had been at the point where the motorbike crossed the barrier of the Order's charms. He only hoped they would continue to work. He imagined Voldemort 100 yards above them as they spoke, looking for a way to penetrate what Harry visualized as a great transparent bubble. He swung his legs off the sofa. He needed to see Hagrid with his own eyes before he would believe that he was alive. He had barely stood up, however, when a door opened and Hagrid squeezed through it, his face covered in mud and blood, limping a little, but miraculously alive. "Harry!" Knocking over the two delicate tables and an aspidistra. He covered the floor between them in 2 strides and pulled Harry into a hug that nearly cracked his newly repaired ribs. "Blimey, Harry! How'd you get out of that? I thought we were both goners." "Yeah, me too. I can't believe—" Harry broke off. He had just noticed a woman who had entered the room behind Hagrid. "You!" he shouted, and he thrust his hand into his pocket, but it was empty. "Your wand's here, son," said Ted, tapping it on Harry's arm. "It fell right beside you. I picked it up. And that's my wife you're shouting at." "Oh, I'm sorry." As she moved forward into the room, Mrs. Tonks' resemblance to his sister Bellatrix became much less pronounced. Her hair was a light, soft brown, and her eyes were wider and kinder. Nevertheless, she looked a little haughty after Harry's exclamation. "What happened to our daughter?" she asked. "Hagrid said you were ambushed. Where is Nymphadora?" "I don't know," said Harry. "We don't know what happened to anyone else." She and Ted exchanged looks. A mixture of fear and guilt gripped Harry at the sight of their expressions. If any of the others had died, It was his fault. All his fault. He had consented to the plan, giving them his hair. "The portkey," he said, remembering all of a sudden. "We've got to get back to the burrow and find out. Then we'll be able to send you word, or Tonks will, once she's—" "Dora'll be okay, Andromeda," said Ted. "She knows her stuff. She's been in plenty of tight spots with the oars. The portkey's through here," he added to Harry. "It's supposed to leave in 3 minutes, if you want to take it." "Yeah, we do," said Harry. He seized his rucksack, swung it onto his shoulders. He looked at Mrs. Tonks, wanting to apologize for the state of fear in which he had left her, and for which he felt so terribly responsible, but no words occurred to him that did not seem hollow or insincere. "I'll tell Tonks, Dora, to send word when she— Thanks for patching us up. Thanks for everything. He was glad to leave the room and follow Ted Tonks along a short hallway and into a bedroom. Hagrid came after them, bending low to avoid hitting his head on the door lintel. "There you go, son. That's the portkey." Mr. Tonks was pointing to a small, silver-backed hairbrush lying on the dressing table. "Thanks," said Harry, reaching out to place a finger on it, ready to leave. "Wait a moment," said Hagrid, looking around. "Harry, where's Hedwig?" She got hit," said Harry. The realization crashed over him. He felt ashamed of himself as the tears stung his eyes. The owl had been his companion, his one great link with the magical world whenever he had been forced to return to the Dursleys. Hagrid reached out a great hand and patted him painfully on the shoulder. "Never mind," he said gruffly. "Never mind. She had a great old life." "Hagrid," said Ted Tonks warningly, as the hairbrush glowed bright blue, and Hagrid only just got his forefinger to it in time. With a jerk behind the navel, as though an invisible hook and line had dragged him forward, Harry was pulled into nothingness, spinning uncontrollably, his finger glued to the portkey as he and Hagrid hurtled away from Mr. Tonks. Seconds later, Harry's feet slammed into the ground, and he fell onto his hands and knees in the yard of the burrow. He heard screams. Throwing aside the no longer glowing hairbrush, Harry stood up, swaying slightly, and saw Mrs. Weasley and Ginny running down the steps by the back door, as Hagrid, who had also collapsed on landing, clambered laboriously to his feet. "Harry? You're the real Harry? What happened? Where are the others?" cried Mrs. Weasley. "What do you mean? Isn't anyone else back?" Harry panted. The answer was clearly etched in Mrs. Weasley's pale face. "The Death Eaters were waiting for us," Harry told her. "We were surrounded the moment we took off. They knew it was tonight. I don't know what happened to anyone else. 4 of them chased us. It was all we could do to get away, and then Voldemort caught up with us." He could hear the self-justifying note in his voice, the plea for her to understand why he did not know what had happened to her sons, but— "Thank goodness you're all right," she said, pulling him to a hug he did not feel he deserved. "Haven't you got any brandy, have you, Molly?" asked Hagrid a little shakily. "For medicinal purposes." She could have summoned it by magic, but as she hurried back toward the Cricket House, Harry knew that she wanted to hide her face. He turned to Ginny, and she answered his unspoken plea for information at once. "Ron and Tonks said they should have been back, but they missed their portkey. I came back without them," she said, pointing at a rusty oil can lying on the ground nearby. "And that one," she pointed to an ancient sneaker, "should have been Dad and Fred's, but they were supposed to be second. You and Hagrid were third, and—" she checked her watch. "If they made it, George and Lupin ought to be back in about a minute." Mrs. Weasley reappeared carrying a bottle of brandy, which she handed to Hagrid. He uncorked it and drank it straight down in one. "Mom!" shouted Ginny, pointing to a spot several feet away. A blue light had erupted in the darkness. It grew larger and brighter, and Lupin and George appeared, spinning and then falling. Harry knew immediately that there was something wrong. Lupin was supporting George, who was unconscious, and whose face was covered in blood. Harry ran forward and seized George's legs. Together, he and Lupin carried George into the house and through the kitchen to the sitting room, where they laid him on the sofa. As the lamplight fell across George's head, Ginny gasped, and Harry's stomach lurched. One of George's ears was missing. The side of his head and neck were drenched in wet, shockingly scarlet blood. No sooner had Mrs. Weasley bent over her son than Lupin grabbed Harry by the upper arm and dragged him, none too gently, back into the kitchen, where Hagrid was still attempting to ease his bulk through the back door. "Oi!" said Hagrid indignantly. "Let go of him! Let go of Harry!" Lupin ignored him. "What creature sat in the corner of the first time that Harry Potter visited my office at Hogwarts?" he said, giving Harry a small shake. "Answer me." A grindy low in a tank, wasn't it?" Lupin released Harry and fell back against the kitchen cupboard. "What was that about?" roared Hagrid. "I'm sorry, Harry, but I had to check," said Lupin tersely. "We've been betrayed. Voldemort knew that you were being moved tonight, and the only people who could have told him were directly involved in the plan. You might have been an imposter." "So why aren't you checking me?" panted Hagrid, still struggling to fit through the door. "You're half-giant," said Lupin, looking at Hagrid. "The Polyjuice Potion is designed for human use only." "None of the Order would have told Voldemort we were moving tonight," said Harry. The idea was dreadful to him. He could not believe it of any of them. "Voldemort only caught up with me toward the end. He didn't know which one I was in the beginning. If he'd been in on the plan, he would have known from the start I was the one with Hagrid." "Voldemort caught up with you?" said Lupin sharply. "What happened? How did you escape?" Harry explained briefly how the Death Eaters pursuing him had seemed to recognize him as the true Harry Potter, how they had abandoned the chase, how they must have summoned Voldemort, who had appeared just before he and Hagrid had reached the sanctuary. Harry explained briefly how the Death Eaters pursuing them had seemed to recognize him as the true Harry, how they had abandoned the chase, how they must have summoned Voldemort, who had appeared just before he and Hagrid had reached the sanctuary of Taunt's parents. "They recognized you? But how? What had you done?" Harry tried to remember. The whole journey seemed like a blur of panic and confusion. I saw Stan Shunpike, you know, the bloke who was the conductor on the night bus, and I tried to disarm him instead of... Well, he didn't know what he's doing, does he? He must have been a Imperiist." Lupin looked aghast. "Harry, the time for disarming has passed. These people are trying to capture and kill you. At least stun if you aren't prepared to kill." "We were hundreds of feet up. Stan stunned himself, and if I'd stunned him and he'd fallen, he'd have died the same as if I used Avada Kedavra. Expelliarmus saved me from Voldemort 2 years ago," Harry added defiantly. Lupin was reminded him of the sneering Hufflepuff Zacharias Smith, who had jeered at Harry for wanting to teach Dumbledore's army how to disarm. "Yes, Harry," said Lupin with painful restraint, "and a great number of Death Eaters witnessed that happening. Forgive me, but it is a very unusual move then, under imminent threat of death. Repeating it tonight in front of Death Eaters who either witnessed or heard about the first occasion was close to suicidal." "So you think I should have killed Stan Shunpike?" said Harry angrily. "Of course not," said Lupin. "But the Death Eaters, frankly, most people, would have expected you to attack back. Expelliarmus is a useful spell, Harry, but the Death Eaters seem to think it is your signature move, and I urge you not to let it become so." Lupin was making Harry feel idiotic, yet there was still a grain of defiance inside him.